Vaccines suffer two problems. I think the first is that they're a victim of their own success. I mean, most people don't see vaccine preventable diseases, and so therefore they're less compelled to get them. And I think that's also true for young doctors. I mean, young doctors also don't see these diseases. They didn't grow up with these diseases, so I don't think they can appreciate them at some level. And the second thing is there is just much more readily available misinformation, disinformation than we've ever had before.
All of this didn't happen overnight. And what I mean by this misinformation, looking back, obviously in the last 15 to 20 years, maybe in the last 5 years, what do you see as the biggest turning points that led to this increased erosion of trust in vaccines? And which of those moments do you think we still misunderstand?
I think the turning point on how people perceive vaccines occurred in mid-April of 1982. Mm-hmm. That's when there was a film that was put out called DPT Vaccine Roulette. And it was a very emotional film. It showed a series of pictures of children with sort of staring vacantly up in the sky, seizing, bicycle helmets, drooling. And so I think that sort of gave birth to the notion that vaccines might be doing more harm than good. I mean, the media picked that up. There was congressional testimony that sort of echoed that notion. That to me was the birth of distrust, if you will.
Yeah.
In terms of the state of the art for vaccines, we have made vaccines that have now prevented us from having meningitis and sepsis and pneumonia and paralysis from polio and congenital birth defects from rubella. So the state of vaccines is excellent. The problem is how vaccines are being perceived.
Hello and welcome back to the Peds Doc Talk podcast. I am Dr. Mona, pediatrician, your online mom friend, and someone who's just so grateful to have this platform. We have the most amazing guests coming in 2026, and today's guest is one of those people. But before I get into that, I just want to really thank you all for showing up for the show. It's because of your downloads. It's because of the way you share the show, send it to people you love on social media. This is how the show grows. And especially in the parenting space, as you all know, I'm one of the only pediatricians in the top 30 parenting podcasts, but also I'm one who talks about the more difficult things that people kind of shy away from in the parenting space. And it shouldn't be difficult. Vaccines, morality, public health issues. And so today's guest fits that bucket. He is one of the pioneers and someone that I really admire as a pediatrician, as a pro-science educator. And you should know who he is. But my reality here is that I know so many people who consume content may not know who he is and how much he's done for vaccines. And this is Dr. Paul Offit. He is the director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as well as the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and a professor of pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. I mean, already, let's talk about his education and his desire to teach. Dr. Offit is currently a voting member on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee and has previously served on the Advisory Committee for Immunization practices of the CDC. He is also the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, Rotatech, recommended for universal use in infants by the CDC, the AAP in 2006, and by the WHO in 2013. I cannot express how much of a pioneer I'm talking about when he was involved in the creation of a vaccine that has helped so many lives. And this vaccine was estimated recently to save about 165,000 lives a year. He's also the author of 11 books, 11 for the public about science, medicine, and vaccines. You are worthy of that intro, Dr. Offit, and I hope anytime you're introduced that you're introduced with that level of love. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thanks for asking me, Mona. It's my pleasure.
We connected previously on an event we did for journalists. It was a virtual panel that we had done talking about the status of science education, misinformation regarding vaccines, and that was an honor to sit in that same virtual room as you. And so after that session, I asked you if you would come on here, and I just felt like I hit the jackpot getting someone like you on my show, a show that is really, really committed to sharing evidence-based information and help parents make the right choices for their children. And you've spent decades not just studying vaccines, developing them, but explaining them to parents, clinicians, and policymakers. And we're talking today about the state of vaccines in America, because obviously it's been very volatile, and what parents need to understand now. And I want this conversation to slow things down and focus on what's actually happening and not just the noise. And my hope is that if you're listening to this today, that even if you agree with us, what we're saying, and you're like, oh yeah, I know Dr. Offit, I know Dr. Mona, I agree. Please share it because this is how we get this information out to someone who may be on the fence of vaccines, someone who may be spreading misinformation. So I'd like to get into it if you're ready for me.
I'm ready. Let it rip.
Yeah. So, when people hear that vaccines are under attack, it can sound abstract, especially for the consumer, the patient. They're like, well, what does this mean? But for us in the medical community, we feel that. We felt that for quite some time. But especially now, within the last year, we've seen a lot of changes. From your perspective, what is the real state of vaccines in America as it stands right now? Not headlines or social media, but what you're seeing in your experience on the ground and what you would want parents and pediatricians and professionals to know.
Well, vaccines have saved our lives. I mean, certainly when I was growing up as a child in the 50s, I had measles, I had mumps, I had rubella or German measles, I had chickenpox. I was born before the polio vaccine. And when I
Yeah.
was 5 years of age, for a reason other than polio, I was in a chronic care facility, orthopedic facility, which was a polio ward. So I certainly saw children in iron lungs. I saw children getting the Sister Candy hot pack treatments, there, which caused them to scream. It was a Dickens-like experience. But
Yeah.
I mean, I think in terms of the state of the art for vaccines, we have made vaccines that have now prevented us from having meningitis and sepsis and pneumonia and paralysis from polio and congenital birth defects from rubella. So the state of vaccines is excellent. The problem is how vaccines are being perceived. And I think vaccines suffer two problems. I think the first is that they're a victim of their own success. I mean,
Yeah.
most people don't see vaccine preventable diseases. And so therefore they're less compelled to get them. And I think that's also true for young doctors. I mean, young doctors also don't see these diseases. They didn't grow up with these diseases, so I don't think they can
Yeah.
appreciate them at some level. And the second thing is there is just much more readily available misinformation, disinformation than we've ever had before. And we now have a Secretary of Health and Human Services in Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a virulent anti-vaccine activist and science denialist who is now trying to reshape Health and Human Services to his point of view. So that is, I think, when people say vaccines are under attack, that's what I think of.
Ooh, I think it's so beautifully said, those points right there. And I love that it's a victim of its own success. I believe that is where I heard it first from you. And I was like, that is beautifully said. And to that statement, right? The people who are like, well, yeah, we don't see polio. And I believe as of today, there was a member of the CDC who had mentioned that we should make that optional, the polio vaccine. And I think, like when they're talking about all these optional language and things like that, which we'll get into, what would be your message to those people who say that? Like, well, we don't see it now. What is the point? Why are we doing this?
Well, so we don't see smallpox now, but we
Yeah.
also don't see smallpox anywhere in the world. So we stopped giving the smallpox vaccine to children in 1972, and smallpox is gone. So you don't need that vaccine anymore. But everything else is still around. I mean, measles and rubella and polio, those viruses still circulate. I mean, rotavirus still circulates, influenza virus still circulates, SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID, still circulates. So a choice not to get those vaccines is a choice to risk those diseases. And I think there are diseases we could eliminate measles from the face of the earth.
Yeah.
You sort of divide diseases into two categories. One is short incubation period mucosal infections. By that I mean from the time you're exposed to the virus to when you develop symptoms. You'll never eliminate those diseases. Rotavirus, influenza, SARS-CoV-2, those are short incubation period mucosal infections, but long incubation period diseases like smallpox or
Yeah.
measles or rubella or mumps, you actually could eliminate those diseases. But we haven't, and because they still circulate, you're at risk. Look at what happened in 2022 with Rockland County in New York. There was a
Yeah.
27-year-old man who got paralyzed by polio. The type of virus that paralyzed him, which was a so-called revertant strain from the original polio vaccine, that only causes paralysis in 1 in 2,000 people. So when he was paralyzed, you knew he was the tip of a much bigger iceberg. And that virus was in wastewater samples in Rockland County and surrounding counties. And I think if you look in Philadelphia or Chicago or Los Angeles, you would also find that virus. So lower immunization rates far enough, and polio can certainly come back. And I'm not sure people realize this.
Yeah, I feel that. Obviously, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a lot with my community. As you probably know, my community is a very pro science or pro science leaning. Like if they're vaccine curious, maybe they're like, maybe I'll not get this one, but I'm definitely, wanting to get certain ones and things like that. And so trying to reach the communities that are, again, leaning the other way, making them understand that this is a reality, like you just said. And all of this didn't happen overnight. And what I mean by this misinformation, especially the rise of, RFK Jr. being in a position now to have a government position to give all of this misinformation. So looking back, obviously in the last 15 to 20 years, maybe in the last 5 years, what do you see as the biggest turning points that led to this increased erosion of trust in vaccines? And which of those moments do you think we still misunderstand?
I think the turning point on how people perceive vaccines occurred in mid-April of 1982.
Hmm.
That's when there was a film that was put out called DPT Vaccine Roulette. And it was a very emotional film. It showed a series of pictures of children with sort of staring vacantly up in the sky, seizing, bicycle helmets, drooling, with a variety of neurodevelopmental problems. And all the parents told the same story. My child was fine. Then they got this pertussis or whooping cough vaccine, and now look at them. That led to a flood of litigation. By mid 1980s, 1985, there was $3.2 billion in lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies that made vaccines. And that led to the birth then in 1986 of the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which included the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which stopped the bleeding. But we had 18 companies that made vaccines for America's children in 1980. By 1990, we had four. And if it wasn't for that Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, we would have had none. And so I think that sort of gave birth to the notion that vaccines might be doing more harm than good. I mean, the media picked that up. It was congressional testimony that sort of echoed that notion. That to me was the birth of distrust, if you will.
Yeah. And how do you think, do you, like, so obviously I was, to be quite frank, I was born after that period. So I'm a 1985 baby. And I started practicing about 10 years, over 11 years ago. Do you think the pandemic played a role also in sort of how this this vaccine acceptance, hesitancy, anti-vax sentiment, or you feel like it's kind of always been there and amplified just because of social media?
I think it's always been there, but I
Yeah.
do think it definitely amplified during the pandemic for a couple of reasons. I think that in 2020, when the virus came into this country and started killing people in February of
Yeah.
2020, SARS-CoV-2 virus, we didn't have anything. We didn't have monoclonal antibodies until the end of the year. We didn't have vaccines till the end of the year. We didn't have antivirals till the end of the year to try and stop a virus that was killing people, hundreds of people every day. And so what did we do? We shuttered schools, we closed businesses, we restricted travel, and we masked and social distance and quarantine. And I think people saw that as massive government overreach. They didn't like that. And in 2021, when we had a vaccine, because we had a vaccine by December of 2020, you couldn't go anywhere without your vaccine card, your favorite bar, restaurant, sporting
Yeah.
event, wedding. And I think people were fired from their jobs. I think people saw that as government overreach. And I think we leaned into a libertarian left hook, and I think we're feeling the punch. But I think the anti-vaccine information was supercharged by that.
Yeah.
And look at our current Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said in early 2021, while testifying in front of Louisiana legislature, the COVID vaccines were, quote, the most dangerous vaccine ever made. The vaccine ended up killing more people than it saved. I mean, that's our current Secretary of Health and Human Services. This is a nightmare, Mona.
Not, and you know what's so hard about that? So I don't know if you're familiar. Obviously, I'm a pediatrician, but my husband's an ER doctor, and he was working. We live in Florida, and Florida had very lax regulations. Right, there was no, you had to have your card, you had to do this. It was very free for all, and a lot of people moved here who didn't want rules. Like, let's say from the Northeast, where New York had more rules than Florida had, and he saw those patients. I mean, we still to this day talk about those patients that literally decompensated within 24 hours. And if anyone's not familiar with that term, decompensate meaning they walk in, they're feeling crummy, and then within 24 hours, they're on life support or dead. And he will never forget those patients, and that was really hard for us being on the front line and then also hearing that sentiment of this vaccine is not necessary, it's causing more harm than good, because what he saw in his own face and what I saw as a general pediatrician, mainly for him because the vaccine came out for adults first, was that those who were vaccinated were less likely to have those complications. And we saw that. And what I saw from a communication standpoint, because I was on social media, is I did just see a disservice from our side. And I say our side of the pro science, wanting people to encourage them to get, vaccines and masks, is a lot of absolute language, right? 100% safe. You must do this, you must do this, versus these, hey, here's what we're seeing, benefit and risk. This could evolve, but here we are acting in real time. And I think for the first time in modern history, for so many people, especially with access to social media, people were seeing public health in real time, right? They were seeing a novel virus come into this world, and how the formulation happens with the vaccine. And you have been doing that for decades before, right? When rotavirus was around. But we have been so lucky that we haven't seen that in so long. And so now people were seeing this and they're like, oh, wait, it's so rushed. I'm being forced. But I think people forget that that had to happen because people were legitimately dying. Young, healthy adults were dying. And those children at the beginning, the MISC, long COVID, I mean, I was seeing that too. And I think, like you said, people are so blind if they don't see what it actually does. And that was so hard to see. It's like easy to sit behind a keyboard and say, oh, this is doing nothing, it's going to harm you, when that was not fact. There was no data to support that. And that's scary to me, that people were just believing misinformation when everything else was pointing to that this is wrong. Look at what's happening in front of you. People weren't believing their own eyes, which was terrifying to me.
That was the most amazing aspect to me. I mean, when the vaccine rolled out in full in January 2021, by July, we had vaccinated about 70% of the population, which was
Yeah.
pretty amazing, actually. When
Yeah.
you consider there really wasn't an infrastructure for mass vaccinating adults in this country. And then we hit a wall. 30% of this country refused to be vaccinated, even though in 2021, you were 12 times more likely to be hospitalized and die if you weren't vaccinated than if you were. And the following year, 2022, you were 6 times more likely to be hospitalized and die if you weren't vaccinated. And it's amazing how people were denying what was right in front of them. I mean, you can understand how people may be less compelled to get a polio vaccine because
Right.
we eliminated polio from this country by 79. We had one case of polio recently in 2022, but you can see that. But here, everybody knew somebody who had COVID if they didn't have it themselves. I think everybody knew somebody who had significant COVID, and still people were willing to deny. That was what was most amazing to me, how you could deny what was right in front of you. You had people who were dying of COVID who still said they were glad that they made the decision not to get the vaccine. Amazing.
That that is where I'm most concerned. Not only when we talk about vaccines, but obviously there's other things happening in our country right now. I will allude to it. I'm not going to go into detail, like, the ICE raids. And when you see visual date, like you see proof, and your people's eyes they're not believing their own eyes, right? They're not believing data. And I'm worried that data and clinical experience are not enough anymore, right? Like when I communicate and I am saying all the things I know, of course, my community understands, but people are just unable to see data and see what we just talked about, which is the information of doctors saying, hey, look, we don't have PPE. I'm scared of dying. Like my husband still has PTSD from COVID because of the lack of PPE, the lack of that. Does he have it now? No, because COVID has changed in terms of the severity it's doing for, most people. But my question there is, obviously there's no shortage of data, there's no shortage of clinicians preaching, like screaming into the void that this is needed. Do you think that the way vaccines are discussed and communicated should change, whether it's from the AAP? I'm not even going to include the CDC anymore because I just feel like, I don't know, we can talk about if there's a way that we can bring that back. But from the AAP, public health agencies, science communicators, whether it's about benefit and risk, what do you think we can change to help people understand all the things we're talking about here?
Right. Well, so I certainly agree there is no CDC anymore or ACIP.
Right.
I certainly
Yeah.
wouldn't look to them.
Yeah.
I think, it's like I think Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. I think all science communication is also local. I think the key player in this is the physician. I mean, most people trust their doctors. And also it should be pointed out that more than 90% of parents do get vaccinated. And so most parents do believe in vaccines. Secondly, if you look at polls, independent of your political affiliation, Republican, Democrat, or independent, most parents support vaccines and support school entry requirements for vaccines. So we're talking about a very loud but vocal minority. And I do
Yes.
think that when I mean, I'm not in private practice, but my wife is. So I'm sort of watching her go through this as a private practicing pediatrician. And I think you have to realize that people don't see many of these diseases anymore, and there's a lot of bad information out there that's scary. And when people are scared, they're scared. They're legitimately scared. You have to you can't set that aside and just say that that's sort of a foolish thing to be scared about, because they are legitimately scared. And you have to try and do your best to kind of talk them down about how would you answer the question about whether vaccines cause a particular serious adverse event that they're worried about. How would you do that? But I think the irony of the COVID pandemic was, I mean, here was a virus that came into this country that had unusual biological characteristics, unusual clinical characteristics. We to meet that, we used a technology we had never used before, messenger RNA as a platform for this vaccine. Within 11 months of that virus coming into this country and sequencing the genome, we had done 2 large prospective placebo-controlled clinical trials for Moderna and Pfizer. That Operation Warp Speed, I honestly think, was the most amazing scientific or medical achievement in my lifetime. And that was the Trump administration. He should have put his name on it, but I think he didn't put his name on it because at his heart is a deeply modest man who doesn't like to put his name on things. But I could be wrong about that. So, I mean, I think that was an amazing scientific accomplishment, and it got lost in all this. I mean, the 2 people that developed the mRNA platform, at least for infectious diseases, Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman at Penn, won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2023 for this. And that all sort of got lost in this.
I agree, putting the stamp on what we did do good. I mean, it just feels like, again, what I felt is like there was so much progress, so much good. And then because of the staying so staunch on the political leanings of making it that if I'm conservative, I have to be against vaccines, I have to be against mandates, I have to be against this, when you could be a conservative. I have conservative friends, but you can also use logic and use the fact that, hey, I don't think I want my kids to die from these illnesses, or myself, or anyone to just be hospitalized. And I think I hear a lot of which is happening right now with the flu, as you know. So far at the timing of this conversation, there was 32 flu deaths. And then the common thing is, well, it's only 32 people. And I'm like, if you're saying this, especially as a parent, if it was one of your children, I mean, 32 kids dying from a preventable illness when 90% were unvaccinated, 90% of that, I don't think as a mother I would want to hear that, right? That, hey, you know what? It was just a life that had to happen. And so we are seeing healthy children die from vaccine preventable illnesses. And that, again, that is very hard to see. And we can celebrate the success of either administration, and they can own it and say, hey, look, we did this amazing thing. But it just seems like, again, we just are moving so into this politicization of all of this that it has to be so black and white, that if you're conservative, you gotta be MAGA, you gotta be anti-vax. If you're liberal, it's not like that. It is a middle ground that I think so many of us have seen lost. And it's frustrating as a pediatrician and scary too, as a mother.
No, my parents were conservative Republicans, so that's sort of how I grew up. But and when this is decades ago, there was an attempt to, it was called the 317 Coalition. So I was asked to, along with other people who had an expertise in the field, to go around Congress and try and convince people, the congressmen, to support this notion of paying for vaccines for children who were uninsured or underinsured. This is before the Vaccine for Children's program, and the Republicans were great. They were institutionalists. They believed in the CDC. They believed in Health and Human Services. They believed in the ACIP. It's the Democrats that were a pain in the butt because they were largely all per pocket of personal injury lawyers. They overstated vaccine harms. The Republicans, every Republican I met was great. So things have switched is what's happened. So it's hard to use the term conservative. I don't think that it's just not the right term for what's going on right now.
Thank you so much for giving me that history. I mean, that's very important. And I love that you say that because, again, things just shift for whatever reason. And it's not like, okay, you have to be that. And I really appreciate that insight. And for me right now, when I'm Ralph Abraham, who I think is like the second in command at the CDC, principal secretary. I can't remember the term right now, but he had recently gone on some conversations talking about how, losing the measles elimination status isn't the big deal that we make it out to be. And he did say that, we still have vaccines, we still have therapeutics, we still have all of that, but that there should be personal choice. Now, with the current vaccine climate and with some vaccines being delayed and in this situation de-emphasized or even pulled into the recommended schedules in certain settings or giving choice, do you worry that we could start seeing the real return of illnesses? And do you think that vaccine elimination statuses matter, contrary to what Dr. or Mr. Abraham is saying?
Yeah, so what he said that I thought was most egregious is when he said, Ralph Abraham said that these measles cases, and essentially these 3 measles deaths in 2025 were, quote, the cost of doing business.
Right.
And said the biggest problem was this, quote unquote, porous borders. Well, first of all, that's not how measles enters this country. The way measles typically enters this country is American citizens go to countries where measles is endemic, they get measles and they bring it back. So if you mean by porous borders, Americans returning from a trip overseas, I wouldn't call that porous borders. This is just what normally, and it's what always happens. I mean, we eliminated measles in the year 2000 because even though measles would still come into this country from other countries, we had a critical percentage of people that were vaccinated, so the virus could not spread. So the reason that we're seeing measles now, and we've had the biggest measles outbreak last year that we've seen in 33 years, we had 3 deaths from measles last year. That equals the total number of deaths over the last 25 years from measles. And we had 2 children die when we hadn't had a child death from measles since 2003. This is not the cost of doing business. This is us letting our guard down and watching, in the case of West Texas, 2 healthy little 6 and 8-year-old girls die. And, we see these outrageous events in Minneapolis, with 2 people, again, frankly, being murdered and certainly dying unnecessarily. And that's no different to me than these 2 little girls who died. Those were preventable illnesses. This is not okay. We eliminated this virus. And this is a member of the CDC who just throws his hands up and says, well, cost of doing business. And similarly, the new head of the ACIP, Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, Dr. Kirk Milhoan, 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 was just interviewed on a podcast called Why Should I Trust You?, where he also said the same things that you just said, which, it's individual choice. I mean, yes, there will be suffering, but, it's individual choice. And so this whole medical freedom movement is completely at variance with public health, because in public health, you care about your neighbor. And in the medical freedom movement, you don't.
How do we make people believe in their neighbor? I mean, that's the struggle. I don't even know if you have an answer. I know your wife is a pediatrician herself. I'm a science communicator. It just feels, and I would like to say this first, that I agree with what you said earlier, that I believe the large majority want the vaccines, whether it's, on either, like we talk about whatever political leaning you have. It is a small, very vocal community, like you mentioned, right? And they are very good at getting together and spreading their playbook, is what I call it. The same claims, the same rhetoric, all of that stuff. But how do we make it clear? How do we make this clear that this is something that is not just this is lives? It just seems like I'm living in this upside down universe when I know that these things are important. I know as a practicing pediatrician, the benefits outweigh the risk, and just getting that information across is so hard.
It's hard. I mean, it's in that podcast that I just mentioned. I'm listening to now the head of the ACIP basically said that if you choose not to get a measles vaccine, for example, because you believe that the risks outweigh the benefits, that's a laudable decision, even if it negatively affects someone who, say, is immune compromised, which was just a remarkable thing to say. First of all, why would you ever make that decision to begin with? I mean, measles virus, when measles was king, before we had a measles vaccine in 1963, you'd see 48,000 hospitalizations a year from severe pneumonia, severe dehydration, or encephalitis. The vaccine doesn't cause any of those problems. So in terms of risk versus benefits, it's a clear decision. And when you make a decision to put your child and other people's children at risk, that's not a laudable decision. It's an inexcusable decision, frankly. There was actually a measles outbreak, I remember, in 2014, 2015, that sort of centered in Disneyland. So it was really a left-leaning group. This was not a libertarian group. This was kind of the left-leaning, all things natural, don't inject me with anything that has a chemical name group. And so that was the epicenter of an outbreak that then spread to 25 other states. There were maybe 300 cases, not nearly as bad as the outbreak that we're seeing now. And there was a state senator named Richard Pan who wanted to introduce a bill, Senate Bill 277, to eliminate basically the philosophical exemption in California for a state that didn't have a religious exemption. So there would be no non-medical exemption. And the anti-vaccine activists were there in force. There was a little boy whose name was Luke Crowd, and you can still see him on YouTube. And he got up there, and he was little, so he was like 7 years old. So they had to put him on a stool where he could reach the microphone. And he said who he was. He said, my name is Luke. I have leukemia. I can't be vaccinated. I depend on you to protect me. And then looking right at the crowd who was sort of screaming about, this notion of eliminating non-medical exemptions, he looked right at them and he said, "Don't I count?" Of course he counts, but I think the medical freedom movement says he doesn't count.
It feels hard. And I know the next thing that we have both seen, and I haven't seen this in the last 14 years through my training and through being a practicing pediatrician. We saw a complete change in the recommended vaccine schedule from the CDC. To be clear, the AAP released the schedule, which is pretty much what we were doing before, and I appreciate that so much. And a lot of that change came with changing the language, right? That you can still get them. This is personal choice, recommended, change to shared decision making. In your opinion, how would that be interpreted by the public, and what worries you, if anything, about that framing of like this sort of nonchalant, if you want it, you can get it still?
Okay, here's the good news. I think most people are ignoring the ACIP and the CDC. I
Yeah.
mean, the American Academy of Pediatrics, to their credit, immediately stood up and said no. When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said we're going to no longer recommend the routine use of the SARS-CoV-2 COVID vaccine in children, they said no. The same thing with the flu vaccine, same thing with the rotavirus vaccine. They stood up immediately and said no. And they just put out their routinely recommended schedule for 2026, which is a science-based schedule,
Yeah.
unlike the schedule that's done by, now by RFK Jr.'s CDC. I think the thing that struck me was they have this category of shared clinical decision making. First of all, that's always been true. I mean, we've
Right.
always been we've had
Right.
consent, we've had vaccine education sheets, so vaccine information sheets. So we've always had that. That's nothing new. What they're trying to do is saying, well, these are really optional. You can get it, you cannot, because when it's shared clinical decision making, it makes it sound like you can reasonably make a decision not to get them. I think what's interesting about the three viruses that fall into that category, rotavirus, SARS-CoV-2, and flu, is those are all short incubation period mucosal infections. Even if the entire world were vaccinated every year, those viruses would still circulate. So
Mm.
a choice not to get those vaccines is a very real choice to get those infections. I mean, with polio, for example, a choice not to get that vaccine is not an immediate choice to risk that disease, although it's a bad decision. But those three viruses always circulate. I mean, the goal of all three of those vaccines is to keep you out of the hospital, keep you out of the intensive care unit, and keep you out of the morgue. It's not to prevent mild or moderate disease. That's probably the best example of that was SARS-CoV-2, and you alluded to that earlier. I think one mistake that we made early on was we should have made it very clear that the goal of this vaccine was to keep you out of the hospital, not to get
Yes.
mild or moderate disease, because people got mild to moderate disease and they thought, these people promised me something they didn't fulfill.
Exactly that. And I think that's where it started to kind of crumble, and then the conflicting information, but that's what I heard too, from my community online. And so, yeah, that's sort of, we were promised that, hey, like we couldn't get it, when that was never, I think, the intent. It was always the communication should have been similar to something like the flu, like you mentioned, that, hey, you can still get it, but the chances of you getting MISC, the chances of you being hospitalized is going to be reduced if you're thinking about the pediatric population. And then for adults, and that's what we saw clinically. I saw that happen. My husband would tell me, and he's like, we were first in line to get those COVID vaccines. We took a picture because we felt so honored. And so it feels such a like parallel world of like, we're so excited. At the same time, people are like, you're crazy for doing and injecting that poison. And you're like, if you just saw what we see, I don't think you'd have that same feeling, because when you have patient after patient after patient having that in front of you, which you all like, when I think about, I don't know how long your wife has been practicing, but I have, like you said at the beginning of this conversation, I have not seen a lot of these vaccine preventable illnesses because I have been only in training and practice for 14 years total. And that's a blessing. I am so grateful that I have not had to smell rotavirus or manage rotavirus dehydration. And so then, but even though I know that, I think about my colleagues. I'm so blessed to have the training and the leadership of my colleagues who've been doing this more than me, that say, hey, look, it was much different. God bless, or what we have been given here with science of like this advancements. And so it's just, people are not always seeing that, and that is so hard.
No, you're right. I think that when the ACIP sort of, or the HHS, wasn't even the ACIP, sort of came up with their quote unquote new schedule. I mean, the first thing I thought of was, because I trained in pediatrics in the late 70s, my wife in the late 80s, but that's before the Rotavirus vaccine came out, which was in
Hmm.
2006. Our hospital wards were full of kids
Yeah,
with severe dehydration, because I think what people don't remember or don't realize, rotavirus was a vomiting illness. You
yeah.
couldn't rehydrate children because you couldn't give them this frequent sips of fluid that your pediatrician was recommending, with sugar or electrolytes, because they were vomiting and vomiting and vomiting. That's why it was such a rapidly dehydrating illness. I mean, I trained at Children's in Pittsburgh, but we would see 400 children, babies typically 6 to 24 months of age, with severe dehydration. Not fun. And I can only imagine the people who said, well, you can get this vaccine or not, had no experience with that virus.
And so, like, I think about the advancements that I've seen in my career so far. Obviously, we have talked about COVID coming. Obviously that was happening acutely when that became a novel virus that entered the population. But for using that example, I think of RSV, right? For me, training RSV, we called it RSV season. We didn't even call it viral season, right? The wards, like you just mentioned, for Rota covered with children, right? Whether it was on the inpatient floor, the ICU, healthy babies, children with underlying medical conditions. So when the RSV antibody came out, or the RSV vaccine for pregnant people, it was such a celebration, right? I was like, this is amazing science. Like, God, like this is so exciting. And like, again, you nerd out, you look at the data, and then after it came out, you look at all the supporting information, right? Not only clinically, but also from the information of like the reduction of severe disease. And like, that is just such, again, a beautiful thing when people can celebrate medical progress. And I think for me, and I don't know if you follow a lot of my content, but I am very centrist in terms of I am an osteopathic physician, so I love the home remedies. I love acupuncture. I love all of that alternative medicine, but I also celebrate modern medicine and what it's given us, and that can exist together. And that is such a awesome thing when I can meet a family and teach a family that it's not black or white. You can have both of these things and celebrate the alternative remedies, but also know that, hey, I have this RSV antibody or this vaccine that can really reduce my child's risk of getting, like you said, severe disease or in a morgue. And why not do it for yourself? And so that is my modern pediatrician story of like seeing something happen and how good it can do for the world. And it has been. I mean, it's just, we had the mildest RSV season here in Florida thanks to that antibody, because our RSV season is in the summer, and it's just been a blessing. Like, we're keeping kids out of the hospital. That means more families can be seen for other reasons. Like, people don't understand that this is a healthcare system issue too. It's not about just you, it's about your peer, it's about healthcare resources, it's about keeping kids out of the hospital, it's about keeping those doctors and clinicians and staff available for other healthcare issues that are not vaccine preventable. And that's the beautiful thing about vaccines. I love it.
No, I was speaking to a physician group in Kansas City recently, and they said just the same thing you just said, was they can't believe the RSV season that they're not seeing this year.
Yes.
It's really the first year we had both the maternal vaccine and the monoclonal antibody for infants. And there's the CDC put out a report, which they didn't publicize because they were told not to publicize it, but that showed that there was at least a 50% reduction in hospitalizations for the less than 3 month old. So great. So this makes life so much easier and so much better for those children. And yet, we make that RSV is like, I think, for high risk groups. I don't even know what that means, because everybody's at high risk.
And especially when we see that healthy babies are getting super sick, and that's what that recommendation really got me upset, because of I have been giving the RSV antibody to healthy babies, because healthy babies end up in the hospital because there's no risk factor profile for RSV anymore. Like, there wasn't. We had Synagis, which was obviously for our preterm babies, but this Beyfortus, which is the Nirsevimab ALIP, the newer one, that was for everyone, which I've always wanted, because I'm like, hey, I've been seeing this. And so again, just, it's really important our listeners hear that not only from your experience having been in the profession for the years that you have, and also the expertise you've lended in development of a rotavirus vaccine. You saw a problem, you got into development, and you created something amazing. For me, just watching that happen has just been so much of a celebration, again, for what science is capable of. And I just think it's so important for families to see that.
Thank you. It took 26 years.
Yeah.
to create the strains that became that vaccine, but it certainly worked, so that's good.
I love it. And, going on to that, you've helped develop life-saving vaccines. And I'm going to say life-saving, hospital saving, money saving because parents don't have to be in the hospital, which obviously with the Rototech, and have lived this history. And we've talked all about that. Just on a personal level, how does it feel? Just I want to hear from like you as a feeling person to see vaccines become what they've had from the administration, from this misinformation, social media, after dedicating your career to this work.
It breaks my heart, independent of whether or not I had
Yeah.
dedicated my work to creating rotavirus vaccines, because I think for me it was I just see myself, I think, as many pediatricians do, as trying to take care of children who I think what happened to me, I think, is because I was in a polio ward for about 6 weeks as a child, and I saw, the children. It was just a Dickens-like experience. I mean, there was only
Yeah.
one visiting hour a week. My mother couldn't visit me because she was ill with a complication of my brother. My father never visited me because he was a traveling salesman, and so you're there alone for 6 weeks, and you're looking at these children in iron lungs and children in traction, and I think that experience was scarring, and I think the scars of our childhood invariably become the passions of our adulthood. So for me, when I see children suffering, it hits at something that I saw as a 5-year old that really is triggering for me and is so upsetting to me when I see children put it in harm's way. Those two little girls who died in West Texas, I just want to cry that they had to lose their lives because of, frankly, their parents made the choice not to vaccinate them, in large part because of the misinformation that they've heard from people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's been putting out bad information for 20 years now.
I love what you said about the scars of childhood become the things that you fight for in adulthood. That is like probably one of the most quotable phrases you've said today. And I think about my childhood. I think about residency. When people ask why I'm so pro vaccines and are you getting paid by big pharma, and I'm like, no, because let's use some common sense here. Using the RSV example, we are not seeing patients because we gave this vaccine. If I wanted to see patients and make money, I wouldn't give them these preventable illnesses. But in residency is, those stories, right? Like I have two that come to mind. One of them was a cancer patient, like the story you said of that beautiful little boy. He was in the chemotherapy. He was still attending school. He couldn't get live vaccines, and one of them was chickenpox, right? Because you can't get chickenpox when you're undergoing chemo. And he ended up contracting chickenpox from a peer at school, and ended up dying from disseminated chickenpox and not from his cancer. And that won't ever, I won't say his name, but that won't ever leave my head, like ever. In all my years, I will see that face. I will see us resuscitating him in the PICU. I will see all the pressors. For anyone who is not familiar with what a pressor is, anything to just increase your blood pressure, all of the things we had to do, and how much we all cried when he died, because he died from a vaccine preventable illness that a peer did not get. And then the other story that comes to mind is a toddler whose parents did not vaccinate, and the child got Hib meningitis and ended up having what we thought was febrile seizures, right? Because we're like, Hib meningitis isn't common for us, right? And we're like, this isn't right. I'm like, we need to get a tap, and ended up having Hib and ended up surviving, but had lifelong complications with neurological symptoms, hearing loss, brain deficits. And through my residency, I kept in touch with that family, even though they didn't vaccinate. People think that I don't, oh, doctors must not care. We care so deeply about whether you choose to vaccinate or not, but we will also care for you if you choose to vaccinate or not. And the reality that so many of this very staunch anti-vax community are not realizing is that when shit hits the fan, and when all that misinformation finally makes it to you or a friend or a peer, and you need help, it's not going to be the essential oils. It's not going to be the turmeric injections that you're taking. It's going to be medical professionals that are going to treat your child without judgment. And we do that every day. We love children so much, like you said, Dr. Offit. Like, we want them to be outside doing the developmental capabilities they're able to do. And it's so hard when I hear that, because I'm like, listen, I just want you to be outside of my hospital. I don't want to see you in my office. Like, truly, I'm so busy. I want you to be running around doing what you need to do. And I think that's just so important for people to hear. And if you're listening to this and you're like, I agree, share it so people can hear that message. For, both myself and Dr. Offit are sharing.
No, you mentioned meningitis. When I remember, I trained in the late 70s, so we would have these emergency department shifts where we were on 12 off, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. And so this is before the Hib vaccine. It's before the conjugate pneumococcal vaccine. It's before the meningococcal vaccine. I would do 2 to 3 spinal taps a night.
Yeah.
Now, pediatricians, inpatient pediatricians in our hospital generally don't do spinal taps. Usually it's the interventional radiologist that does it because they're just not that used to doing it.
Yeah. And my husband said the same thing. He teaches residents at the hospital, and they do have pediatric patients. And he's like, just because of because of vaccines, my residents are not getting experience with learning how to do taps. God bless. Like I'm saying, like this is it. This is great. We don't want to do invasive procedures if we don't need it, but we have to protect your children. And that's what this all is about. And my last question for you. Of course, I want to talk to you for so long, but I just so appreciate you taking the time today. What do you wish people who are opposed to vaccines and those who are unsure or hesitant just can truly understand about where we are right now with vaccines and children's health? And what would you say to those people as a final uplifting message?
I think our job as parents is to put children in the safest position possible, and vaccines provide that safety. And to realize that a choice not to get a vaccine is not a risk-free choice. It's a choice to take a different and more serious risk, and you never think it's going to happen to you. You don't. If you listen to these parent activist groups like Families Fighting Flu, Meningitis Angels, National Meningitis Association, those parents all at some point made a decision not to vaccinate.
Yeah.
Their children suffered or died from a vaccine-preventable disease, and then God bless them, they saw this as a calling, where they would then get out there and try and explain to other parents about how important it is to vaccinate, about how deadly these diseases can be. But they all tell the same story. I can't believe this happened to me until it happens to you, because we have this sort of myth of invulnerability. I mean, my children, not surprisingly, are fully vaccinated, but never would I imagine they could ever suffer these diseases. It's too horrible to imagine.
As are mine, and I think there's always that misinformation that goes around that pediatricians don't vaccinate their kids. And I'm like, I don't know who you're talking to, but I don't know a single pediatrician that's not a grifter online that has sold their soul to, book deals and anti-vax conferences that doesn't vaccinate their children. I did the same on schedule for both my beautiful babies. I recommend it for my families. I have beautifully growing children. That misinformation that kids with vaccines have more negative health outcomes like allergies and asthma and eczema is not true. There's so many layers to health, but I completely agree with that. And I do have one more question. I lied. So, as we close, what keeps you engaged in this work? And what still gives you hope about where vaccine conversations in America could go?
I think it's what I mentioned earlier. I see this as a mission for me.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's why, despite the hate mail, occasional death threats, and all the negative attention, you mentioned earlier that I was on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. I was on the FDA Vaccine Advisory
yes.
until RFK Jr. took me off, which was I was on for 8 years. And then they asked me to be on another 4 years. I agreed. I was on the agenda. And then he personally took me off. Whereas he fired the whole ACIP, he only took me off the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, which I take as a badge of honor. I'm glad I'm getting on his nerves. But, so I just think it's anger at some point. I mean, anger is what drives me, because I just feel myself as being one of the people responsible for those 2 little girls who died. And you just have to constantly fight the fight that RFK Jr. is in the position he's in. I will be doing this no matter how much hate mail I get until he's gone.
Thank you for fueling your anger into action and advocacy. That is what I love. That is how we change things. So I love to see that. And I've seen that in you. Dr. Offit, thank you so much for joining me. I mean, this was such a great conversation. Not only, like I said earlier, do I respect you as a fellow clinician, but also the work you do for vaccines, for educating in a very real way, in a non-shameful way, right? You are not saying that you're a bad person for not vaccinating, but you're giving facts. You're explaining exactly what we need to do. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for asking. It's my pleasure.
And for everyone tuning in, please share this episode. You know what you need to do. So I already mentioned it. You got to subscribe to the show. You got to download the episode, and you got to share it. Even if you agree with everything we said, the only way we can get it to people who may not agree is to share the episode. And if you want to share it with someone who's on the fence or more vaccine, anti-vaccine, just say, hey, I really would love you to listen to this episode to just hear a very balanced discussion about vaccines. I think we would really appreciate it, and leave those reviews. And I cannot wait to have another guest next time for another amazing conversation here on the show.